A billionaire stood at the entrance of his mansion, holding his twin babies close one last time. To anyone watching, he looked like any loving father saying goodbye before a business trip. His smile was warm. His words were gentle. But inside, his heart was a storm of doubt and suspicion that refused to be quiet. "I'll be back in a few days," he told his staff, adjusting his expensive suit. "There's an urgent meeting overseas. Take care of everything while I'm gone." The household staff nodded respectfully. The maid, a soft-spoken woman who'd been caring for his twins for months, smiled politely and reached for the babies. But as she took them into her arms, the billionaire's eyes lingered just a moment too long. Watching, studying, suspecting. You see, for weeks now, something had been eating at him. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing he could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." It was more like a shadow following him everywhere he went. A whisper in the back of his mind saying that something inside his own home wasn't right. His twin babies were his only weakness. In a world where everything could be bought, controlled, or negotiated, they were the one pure thing money couldn't touch. They were the only love he truly believed in. And that made them precious. Dangerously precious. The maid seemed perfect. Too perfect, maybe. She was always kind, always careful, always patient. But he'd been betrayed before. In business, in relationships, in life. Those experiences had turned his ability to trust into something fragile. Like glass that had been shattered and glued back together. Never quite the same. As his car pulled away from the mansion, he kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the house grow smaller. His driver made polite conversation about the weather, about traffic, about nothing that mattered. The billionaire barely heard him. His heart was beating too loud, his thoughts racing too fast. And then, instead of heading toward the airport like he'd told everyone, he did something he'd never done before. "Turn around," he told his driver quietly. "Sir, turn around. Take the side roads. Drop me off 2 blocks from the house." The driver hesitated, confused, but he knew better than to question his employer. Within minutes, the billionaire was walking back toward his own home on foot, like a stranger. Like someone who didn't belong. Each step felt heavier than the last. His mind spiraled through terrible scenarios. Images no parent ever wants to see. What if she was careless with them? What if his babies were crying right now, alone and scared? What if his wealth, his success, his constant absence had blinded him to real danger happening right under his own roof? His hands were trembling slightly as he reached the front door. He could hear his own breathing, slow, controlled, but his heart? His heart was pounding like warning drums, like something inside him knew that whatever he was about to see would change everything. He pushed the door open as quietly as possible. The entrance hall was silent. Empty. He moved through the house like a ghost, heading toward the living room where he knew the babies would be at this time of day. He was ready for anger. Ready to fire someone. Ready to protect his world with all the power and authority his money gave him. But when he reached the doorway and looked inside, he froze. Completely froze. Because what he saw was nothing like what he'd imagined. The maid was lying flat on the carpet, and his twin babies were standing on her back. At first, his brain couldn't process it. But then he saw their faces, both of them laughing, giggling like this was the most wonderful game in the world. The maid was holding their tiny hands firmly, keeping them steady, making absolutely sure they wouldn't fall. Her eyes were focused, completely present. Not distracted. Not annoyed. Not careless. One baby bounced with excitement, testing his balance. The other clapped her hands loudly, squealing with delight. And the maid? Her face showed pure, genuine patience. Not the kind you fake when the boss is watching. The real kind. The kind that comes from actually caring. He looked around the room with new eyes. Toys were scattered everywhere, yes, but not carelessly. Soft pillows had been placed strategically around the carpet. A safety net, he realized. She'd prepared this space. Thought it through. Made it safe for them to play, to explore, to learn. The anger that had been building inside him for weeks started to fade. Slowly. Reluctantly. And in its place came something much more uncomfortable. Confusion. He'd expected to find neglect. Maybe even cruelty. He'd prepared himself to witness the worst. But instead, he was watching effort. Warmth. A bond he'd never noticed before, even though it had apparently been growing right in front of him this whole time. The maid spoke softly to the twins, her voice gentle and encouraging. "Good job. You're so strong. Almost there. Yes, that's it." She was teaching them balance, celebrating every wobbly step like a proud mother. Then his son leaned too far to one side, about to tumble. But before the billionaire could even move, before he could even shout a warning, her hands were already there. Steady. Protective. Her reflexes were instant, the kind of instinct that money absolutely cannot buy. And that's when the guilt hit him. It crept into his chest quietly at first, then settled there like something heavy and sharp. Because all his worst assumptions, all his suspicions, all his secret surveillance, they were being shattered by a simple truth he'd refused to see. This woman genuinely cared about his children. He stood there in the doorway, hidden from view, and a realization washed over him like cold water. He'd never once asked her how she managed. Never asked what her days were like, caring for two energetic babies without rest, without help, without anyone to relieve her when she was exhausted. From his position in the hallway, he noticed something else. Something small but significant. There was a bruise on her arm, faint but visible. Like she'd bumped into something, or maybe one of the twins had kicked during a diaper change. Evidence of a life harder than she let on. Pain she never complained about. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. For the first time since hiring her, he didn't see the maid. He saw a human being. A woman with feelings, with struggles, with a heart that had somehow made room for his children, even though she had every reason to treat this as just another job. He stepped back from the doorway quietly, pressing himself against the wall. Not because he was still spying, but because shame had become heavier than the anger he'd carried all the way home. His twins' laughter echoed through the house, warm, genuine, free. Not the sound of children who were afraid or neglected. This was the sound every parent dreams of hearing. The sound of pure joy. And suddenly, memories flooded his mind. All those times he'd come home late from work. All those bedtime stories he'd missed because of important meetings. All those moments when he'd chosen profits over presence, success over connection. While he'd been out there building an empire, someone else had been in here building something far more important. His children's sense of safety. Their capacity for joy. Their ability to trust. The maid gently wiped a bit of drool from his daughter's chin, then kissed her forehead softly. It was such a small gesture. Automatic. Natural. The kind of thing you do without thinking when you genuinely love someone. His daughter responded by wrapping her tiny arms around the maid's neck, hugging her tightly. And the billionaire's throat tightened because he recognized that hug. It was the kind of hug children give only to people they feel completely safe with. The kind they used to give him before his absence became normal. He realized something terrifying in that moment. Absence creates distance. And distance, over time, allows strangers to become the people your children run to when they're hurt, scared, or happy. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his entire adult life, this powerful, wealthy man didn't feel powerful at all. He felt small. Like all his money had somehow made him poor in the ways that actually mattered. Tears formed in his eyes, but he wiped them away quickly. Not because of pride, but because the pain was so sharp, so real, that he couldn't afford to let it overwhelm him. Not yet. He'd come home today fearing betrayal, ready to catch someone in the act of failing him. But standing there in the hallway of his own mansion, watching his children laugh with someone who genuinely loved them, he understood the real truth. He wasn't the one being betrayed. He was the one who'd been emotionally abandoning his children every single day. And this moment, this painful, beautiful, unexpected moment, wasn't about her mistake. It was about his. The billionaire stood frozen in the hallway, watching from the shadows like a stranger in his own home. And for the first time in years, he truly looked at the space around him. Really looked. Not with the eyes of a man rushing through on his way to the next meeting, but with the eyes of someone finally willing to see. There, on the wall near the kitchen, was a feeding chart. Handwritten. Detailed. Every feeding time was logged. Every nap. Every diaper change. But it wasn't just the practical stuff. There were little notes, too. Smiled at the bird outside. Fussy today might be teething. Laughed at Peekaboo for 10 minutes straight. She'd been tracking every moment of his children's lives. Every milestone. Every mood change. Every tiny victory. Like a mother guarding something precious and fragile. He moved closer to the living room entrance, still hidden, still watching. The milk bottles were lined up neatly on the side table, washed and ready. The toys weren't just thrown in a box. They were sorted by type, organized so the babies could easily choose what they wanted. Baby blankets were folded with a kind of care and patience he'd never stopped to notice before. How long had this been going on? How long had she been creating this world of order and love while he was busy elsewhere? His chest tightened with a shame so heavy he could barely breathe. In the living room, his daughter had crawled off the maid's back and was now playing with blocks. His son was still holding the maid's hand, practicing his wobbly steps. And the maid? She was smiling. Not the forced smile of someone being paid to care, but the real, exhausted, beautiful smile of someone who'd forgotten where the job ended and the love began. The billionaire's throat constricted, because his children were looking at her the way they used to look at him, with complete trust, with joy, with the kind of comfort that says, "You're my safe place." When had that changed? When had he stopped being their safe place? He knew the answer. It had been gradual. One missed bedtime at a time. One daddy's too busy at a time. One business trip at a time. Until absence became normal, and normal became the way things were. Tears formed again, and this time he let them fall. Not from pride or ego, but from a pain he'd been running from for too long. He'd feared betrayal. He'd feared someone would hurt his children or steal from him or prove that money couldn't protect the things he loved. But the real betrayal had been his own. Every day he chose work over them. Every night he came home after they were already asleep. Every weekend he spent on his phone instead of on the floor playing with them. He'd been so afraid of outside threats that he'd become the danger himself. Not through cruelty, but through absence. Through the slow, quiet abandonment that comes when success becomes more important than presence. And now, standing in the hallway of his mansion, a house he'd bought to give his children everything, he realized something that shattered him completely. While he'd been building an empire outside, someone else had been building his children's entire world inside. He took a deep breath, then another, and then, moving slowly, as if approaching something sacred and fragile, he stepped into the living room. The maid looked up instantly, and the moment her eyes met his, terror flooded her face. Pure, unfiltered fear. She thought she'd done something wrong. She was certain this was the end. She quickly helped both twins sit safely on the cushions, then stood up, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice breaking. They were practicing standing. I never left them alone. I was watching them every second. I would never. "Stop," he said quietly. She froze, eyes wide, waiting for the anger she was certain would come next. But he didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He didn't unleash the cold authority that made boardroom executives nervous and employees afraid. Instead, he looked at his children first. Both of them had turned toward him, their tiny faces lighting up with recognition. His daughter reached her arms up toward him. His son gave him that gummy, drooling smile that made his heart ache. Then his eyes returned to the maid. And when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I saw everything." She went pale. Her lips trembled. She was certain those 3 words were the beginning of the end. But then he continued. "You protected them," he said slowly, each word carrying a weight he couldn't hide. "Better than I have in a very long time." Her eyes filled with tears. Not from fear now. From relief. From something she'd been hoping for but never dared to expect. To be seen. To be understood. To be valued not just as hired help, but as a person who genuinely cared. The room felt different now. Not like employer and employee, but like 2 people connected by the same fragile, precious responsibility. The billionaire walked over to the couch and sat down slowly, almost carefully. His twins immediately rushed toward him. Well, his daughter crawled and his son toddled unsteadily and climbed into his arms. But even as he held them close, his eyes stayed on the maid, really seeing her for the first time. The dark circles under her eyes told stories she'd never shared. The exhaustion etched into her face. The way her shoulders sagged slightly, like someone who'd been carrying weight for too long without rest. "How often do you play with them like this?" he asked gently, his voice stripped of all authority and pride. She lowered her eyes, respectful as always. "Whenever they miss you, sir," she said quietly. "I try to keep them smiling." Those words hit him harder than any business loss he'd ever faced. Harder than any deal that fell through. Harder than any competitor who'd outsmarted him. Because the truth doesn't shout. It whispers. And sometimes those whispers cut deeper than screams. She'd been filling the empty hours his absence created. Giving warmth and attention in the spaces where silence used to live. Making his children feel loved when he wasn't there to do it himself. His daughter settled against his chest, content and warm. But her little hand was still holding the maid's dress. Gripping it like a lifeline. Like she needed both of them to feel completely safe. That tiny gesture broke something inside him. Because love can't be replaced by gifts. By expensive toys. by a big house or a trust fund or promises of a better future. Love is measured in moments, in presence, in the hands that catch you when you fall. I judged you without knowing you, he admitted, and each word felt like pulling glass from a wound. I thought the worst. The maid shook her head quickly, uncomfortable with the vulnerability in his voice. They're like my own, sir, she said softly. I only want them to feel loved and safe. In that moment, his guilt transformed into something else. Something deeper. Respect. Gratitude. A recognition that some debts can't be repaid with money. He looked around the room again, seeing all the details he'd rushed past for months. The clean bottles. The organized toys. The folded blankets. The feeding chart with its careful handwriting and loving notes. She'd been doing all of this alone. How long have you been managing everything by yourself? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. Since your wife travels often for work, sir. And you come home late most nights. So they're usually with me. The truth didn't accuse him. It didn't have to. It simply existed, filling the room like light exposing dust. He remembered all the missed calls from home. The text messages he'd replied to with one word. Busy. The weekends he'd spent answering emails instead of playing on the floor. The mornings he'd left before the twins woke up, and the nights he'd returned after they were asleep. His success suddenly felt hollow, like a trophy he'd won by sacrificing the very things that made winning worthwhile. The twins played between them now, babbling happily, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted, that the ground beneath their little world had cracked open and was slowly being rebuilt into something stronger. And in their innocent laughter, he heard something he'd been too deaf to notice before, a second chance. Knocking gently, waiting to see if he was finally ready to answer. He stood up slowly and walked toward the maid. For the first time since she'd started working for him, his voice carried no authority. No distance. Just honesty. I owe you more than a salary, he said quietly. You gave my children something I failed to give them. She shook her head quickly, embarrassed. I just did what any caring person would do. But he knew better. Not everyone chooses patience over frustration. Not everyone treats other people's children like their own. Not everyone gives their heart to a job that most would see as simply work. I was wrong about you, he said. And those 5 words carried more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. The maid's eyes filled again, but she was smiling now. A tired, genuine smile. He turned back to his twins and knelt down, pulling them both close. Papa's going to be home more, he whispered, making a promise he should have made long ago. I promise. That evening, he did something he'd never done before. He canceled his meetings. All of them. He turned off his phone, actually powered it down completely, and stayed on the floor with his children. Playing, laughing, being present. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the house felt warm. Not because of the expensive heating system or the luxury furnishings, but because presence had replaced distance, because respect had replaced suspicion, because gratitude had replaced doubt. And slowly, quietly, a family began healing. The maid sat nearby, watching with tears in her eyes as the billionaire played peekaboo with his son and stacked blocks with his daughter. She'd prayed for this moment, not for recognition or praise, but for the children, for them to have their father back. As the evening light faded and the twins finally grew tired, the billionaire looked at the maid one more time. Thank you, he said simply, for loving them when I forgot how. She nodded, unable to speak. Because sometimes the richest lessons come completely free. They teach us that love isn't proven by money, but by time, by presence, by the small sacrifices we choose to make every single day. Children don't remember expensive gifts. They remember who sat beside them when they laughed or cried, who held them when they were scared, who played with them when they needed to feel loved. And the people we suspect the most are sometimes the very ones protecting our world while we chase success that means nothing without someone to share it with. Work can build a future, but absence can quietly destroy the home that future was meant to support. Real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in warm memories, in trust, in the moments that can never be bought back once they're gone. Second chances arrive quietly. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They simply wait, patient and hopeful, for humble hearts that are finally ready to see them. And on this day, in this house, a heart that had been closed for too long finally opened. Not because of tragedy or loss, but because love, real, selfless, patient love, had been there all along, waiting to be noticed.